Good morning, everybody. We read the Torah just last week, the mitzvah of appointing a king. And the question that we're going to raise and discuss is whether, in fact, it is a mitzvah to have a king, to appoint a king, even though the Torah says you should appoint a king. So, the Gemara has an interesting take on this. The Gemara says, Gemara in Sanhedrin, V'chein haya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Shalosh mitzvot nitztavu Yisrael b'chnisasan le'eretz. There are three mitzvot the Jewish people were commanded when they entered Israel. Lahamid lahem melech, to appoint the king. Lahachir zara shel Amalek, to destroy Amalek. Livnos lehem beis hapira, and to build a beis hamikdash. Those were three mitzvot that were commanded to the Jewish people when they entered Israel. The Torah itself, going back to the parts that we read, it talks about ki savo el haaretz, when you enter the land. Now, the next few words are very, very crucial to our discussion. The amarta, what's the amarta? Plural tense, and the future tense. You will say, the amarta, when you will say, or if you will say, Osima alai melech kechol hagoyim asher suvivosai. If you say, we want to have a king like all the goyim around us, all the nations around us. So there's an option. God is giving Bnei Israel an option, it would seem, not necessarily a commandment. If you would like to have a king, then Som tosim alecha melech, you can appoint a king, which Hashem will approve. Asher yivchar Hashem elokecha, mikerav achecha tosim alecha melech, and it has to be a Jewish king. It shouldn't be a non-Jewish king. We've had occasionally. Herod was half Idumean. Los lusa losucha loses alecha ish nachri asher lo achicha. You can't have a non-Jew who is not among your brethren as the king. Okay, and by the way, there's a separate discussion that we might have at some other occasion. When it says Som Tosim Alecha Melech, so the Sifri, not the Gemara, but the Sifri, which is the halachic medrash explaining Psukim, the Sifri says Melech velo Malka, that you should have a king, not necessarily a queen. That's all it says. The original Sifri, Melech velo Malka. The Rambam, writing much, much later, the 12th century, adds an extra line. He says, Melech velo Malka, and similarly for all communal offices, should not be a woman. Buried when the Rambam lived in a Muslim country. Now, that's his personal view, not borne out necessarily by any Talmudic texts. When they copied over the Sifri, again, the printing press wasn't invented until much later, so all these manuscripts were copied by hand. When one of the copyists copied the Sifri, they included that line from the Rambam. Melech velo Malka, v'chein l'chol mesimos b'Yisrael, and that became the standard text. So all those people who object to women being in communal authoritative positions, look at the Sifri. It's a Talmudic text, or close to a Talmudic text. But in fact, it's a scribal addition, which was pointed out by the Bach, by the Vilna Gaon, that it doesn't exist in the original manuscripts of the Sifri. But it is what it is in terms of some people misinterpreting that pasuk. But I want to get back to Kings, yeah. Yes.
You could interpret that one king cannot be married because of easy marriage.
No.
His wife is automatically a mom. She's automatically a queen.
Yeah. All right, but nobody makes that connection. I can see it, but nobody makes that connection. Melech velo Malka, the interpretation and the understanding traditionally has always been that you should have a king over the Jewish people, not a queen. in point of fact, we've had several queens. They were pretty decent ones too. We had a couple of queens in Jewish history. But technically, the Torah would, according to the rabbinic interpretation of this pasuk, l'chatchila, you should have a king, not a queen. Yeah.
Got a question going back a little bit. What about the Canaan? Are you supposed to kill them also? Because you mentioned a Molech.
Well, no, we have to. The destruction. There were only two nations that we had to utterly destroy: Amalek and Midian. The Canaan, we just had to kick out, and there were 7 nations who inhabited the land, and we had to conquer them and kick them out. Because the land was given to the Jewish people.
You said there were 3 things that
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, the 3. Yeah. Well, the Knisas on the Eretz Yisrael means when you entered the land, when you got rid of all the other nations. Once you were independent, then you can appoint a king, build the Beis Hamikdash, and wage war against them all. Okay. Yeah.
You were quoting it and said, that if you want a king, call up the leader. Which I find interesting because Shiur from Israel wants, they say that they want a king, call up the leader.
Correct.
And one of the reasons that Shiur got so upset because the whole idea is that they're not supposed to be called up.
Okay, you're 100. Well, again, how do you interpret that expression? And I know some of you are studying Shmuel. How do you interpret Kachol Hagoyim? Melech Kachol Hagoyim. Does it mean a king who has the same characteristics of a non-Jewish king, or simply to have an authority other than Hashem, like all the other nations in the world? And that's normally what we interpret. Kachol Hagoyim means other nations have kings. Why shouldn't we have a king? The traditional way. Exactly. We are ruled by the Torah, by Hashem. We have Kohanim, we have Leviim, we have Shoftim. That's all you need. You don't need to add a king on top of that. I mean, you have a legislature, which is the Sanhedrin. Okay? You have the religious authority, which is the Kohanim and Leviim. Okay? You don't need an executive branch. That's a Kadosh Baruch Hu. We don't need more than that. But everybody else has a king. And apparently, throughout history, as when you study Tanakh, unfortunately, there was the fidelity to the Torah was sometimes lacking without somebody to enforce it. And you had good kings and you had bad kings. And when Shmuel reluctantly appointed Shaul, if you get to the end of the Sefer, you realize he made a mistake. Shaul was not the man he thought he was. He defied a basic commandment to destroy Amalek. And then he went after David to kill him out of jealousy. I mean, this was not, again, Melech Kachol Hagoyim is opposed to Melech Malchei Hamloch. So apparently, again, yeah.
It reminds me a little bit like, say, if you want to, it's like, there's a hesitancy, it almost reminds me of with the spies, like, if you want to bring spies into the land.
Right, okay, well, again, Hashem is very gracious to the Jewish people. He gives them options. That doesn't mean you have to exercise every option he gives you. He knows you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu understands human nature better than people do sometimes. So he gives us options. We don't necessarily have to exercise all those options. And when we do, sometimes it backfires. Yeah.
Some of the options, Hashem knows that they're bad options. So the question is though, why are we presented sometimes options that are not the best?
So that's part of human nature too. See, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, knows what's going to happen. Yet he lets you make your mistakes, and hopefully you'll learn from your mistakes. I mean, this is the eternal dialogue: free will versus predestination. How can you say man has free will if HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows everything in advance? And this debate has been going on from day one. And And that's a separate philosophical discussion that you'll fall asleep if we go into all the details of. There are some Rishonim and philosophers who try to limit Hashem's power, which in some places would be horrendous to even think about. Hashem knows what your choices might be. The Rambam raises the question, doesn't come to an answer. He says, yeah, Taka, it's a good question. We believe man has the will to make decisions, whatever you want to do, the good or bad. But we also believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows in advance what those decisions are going to be. So how can they have free will if he knows what you're going to do? Now, these are philosophical questions that are weighty questions. And it's very, philosophy is not for everybody. And when you start getting very deep in philosophy, people start to nod off. Because you get very, very deep. I mean, it's like the standard question that philosophers always ask. If God can do anything, can he create a stone too heavy for him to lift? Think about that for a while. And if you go up with an answer to that, let me know. Well, let's get back to kings now. But again, we're just touching on certain philosophical concepts. I studied a little bit of philosophy, and unless you have a head for it, it's very, very dense. And I admire people who could separate different streams of thought among the various philosophers, Jewish and otherwise, because there's so much out there that your head could just burst. It's a whole separate area that we're not getting into. Okay, so what we have apparently is an optional mitzvah, apparently. Taking upon yourself a king is, again, we will take a look at the Rambam. The Rambam says it's definitely a mitzvah. And many, many Rishonim also hold that it is a mitzvah. You should have a king. But not everybody agrees with it.
Wally,
Yeah.
can't you say that you should have a king? The question is, when should you have the king? At what point in your history should you have it? Like the people wanted Charlotte. I remember it wasn't the right time for them to have a king, and that's why they ended up with Charlotte.
Okay, but
the David already, it was the right time.
so with whom does that decision rest?
It's hard to know that.
If the people say, "Som tasim alecha melech kachol hagoyim," I want to have a king like everybody else, for whatever reason, whether they feel rudderless, there's no leader, or they feel that they need to have a king to tell them what to do, take him into war.
And that's what it's called. Maybe don't say that we just have a need for a king, right? Well, let's just say the Chol HaGoyim. I don't think it's
Okay, but what does it say in Shmuel? We want a king like everybody else.
And that was a problem.
Okay, but again, Hashem lets us make mistakes. Hopefully we'll learn from our mistakes. Unfortunately, in Jewish history, we didn't learn from our mistakes. We have good kings, we have bad kings. If you anybody studies math here, what is the sign of the symbol for a cosine? Symbol for a cosine goes up and down, right? If you're a mathematician. Cosine goes up and down. That's the history of Tanakh. The Jews up and down, up and down. When things were good, you had a good king, and bad, you had good kings, you had bad kings, you had people that were Shomrei Torah mitzvos, and you had times where only avodah zarah. It just goes up and down, up throughout the entire Tanakh. That's what it's like. Yes.
Is that the same situation as the Ragaglim with the spies?
Yes.
We had the opportunity to go if we wanted to.
Correct. It's exactly like the Meraglim. Again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us opportunities to do the right thing or to make mistakes. If Hashem tells you, I'm sending you into an Eretz Tova, I'm sending you into a good land, why would you need Meraglim? Why would you need Meraglim? They didn't have enough faith. So Moshe sent Meraglim, and as a result of that, you saw what happened. Only 2 of them told the truth. The rest were afraid. And I can understand them being afraid. They were slaves for so long, and to become free and to walk into it's a very challenging situation. So either you trust Hashem or you don't trust Hashem. If you trust Hashem, you didn't need Meraglim. And now, how could people not? They saw the 10 Makos, they saw Kriyas Yamsuf, they had the Anan and the Aish, and all these things that were going on. Their clothes didn't rot. They had Mon from the Shamayim, and then they had the Slot. Yet they still had questions. How do you, if any of us today would see some of these miraculous events, would any of us doubt Hashem's presence, existence, power? The truth is, yes, we would. The sun comes up every morning, sets every night. Brings seeds, plants grow. There are miracles around us every single day, and yet people still have difficulties. And it's an age-old problem. Yes.
But Yoshua also sent down spies. He did it a little bit differently than Moshe did it. And over there,
Yeah, Yoshua, but Yoshua,
they learned from their mistake.
there was a big difference. The Meraglim that was sent by Moshe were motivated by the people to see, in fact, what this land was like. The Meraglim sent by Yehoshua were purely for military scouting purposes. He was going to attack Eretz Yisrael. He wanted, what's the best place to attack? So that's what Yoshua was acting like a general. All right, he sent in spies to see how can I attack the city? What's the best way to do it? And in the end, it didn't make a difference. Hashem said, you know what? Go through Yericho, and this is what you'll do, and I will make the walls come down, not your army. I will make the walls come down. You'll circle the city, you'll blow your shofar out, and all of a sudden, the war's over. So the Meraglim in the time of Yeshua were very different from the time of Moshe. All right, so getting back to our mitzvah of a king. In fact, it's not a mitzvah, at least not according to the Rambam. Sefer HaMitzvos, listed as one of the Taryag mitzvos. Many say it's optional. Ibn Ezra, also acceptable authority, says it's optional, which clearly the text indicates. The Abarbanel, living a little bit later, says that, you know what, it's really not desirable to have a king. And he makes a fantastic analogy. He comes up with a category. There are among the mitzvahs of the Torah what we call optional mitzvahs. If you are in a certain situation, you can or cannot. For example, we read about just the other week the mitzvah of Yafas Toar, which is probably one of those mitzvahs where Hashem recognizes the moral failings of people during war. And it says if you're in battle and you see a gorgeous captive woman, you can take her. But you have to cut her nails, you got to cut her hair. There's a whole mitzvah of Yafas Toar if you want to make her your wife. It's captive. Now, the mitzvah of Yafas Toar doesn't mean that we all have to do that. It's an optional mitzvah. It's counted among Taryag mitzvahs, but it's one of the optional mitzvahs. Right? There are many mitzvahs in the Torah that we can't observe because we're not in that category. If I'm not a Kohen, I can't do certain things. If I'm not living in Eretz Yisrael, I cannot do certain things. They're all conditional. If this, then that. Yafas Toar, the average person doesn't have that mitzvah to do, unless you have to be in a war situation where you capture an attractive captive. Yes.
Why is it a mitzvah? I mean, it's a permission to do something.
It's permission. I would say it's a concession to human frailty. And the Kadosh Baruch Hu understands the human psyche. It's a concession. And for whatever reason, it's considered, it's a mitzvah. If you're going to do it the right way. So appointing a king, according to the Abarbanel, is also one of these optional concessions. If you need a king, kachol hagoyim, if you need, for some reason, some authority other than the Torah, other than the Kadosh Baruch Hu, other than the structure the Torah set up with Kohanim, Levim, and Sanhedrin, if you have any need for another structure, okay, appoint a king. Must be male, must be Jewish, right? And are there other restrictions too? Yes.
Term optional, like you're saying. It sounds to me there's a difference between using the word optional and using some term where you can't do it because you don't qualify. Like, if we don't live in Eretz Israel, those mitzvahs aren't optional. They're
Okay,
mitzvahs.
correct.
It's just, we can't do them because we're not there.
Okay,
It doesn't make them optional.
so use the word situational. Okay? I'm glad you're happy. Okay. So, good. And no, the opposed can get into a whole discussion about can you impeach a king? The technicalities, does the Yerusha pass from father to son? There's a lot of fascinating machloks in there. Does a son who inherits his father's throne require a new anointment by the Navi? Fascinating discussion. Okay. The Navi has to be the one that has to anoint the king. A Kohen Gadol cannot be a king. There's separation of powers. And that was the major failing of the Hashmonaim. You study Jewish history. The first generation of Hashmonaim were good guys. But the only problem was when they were victorious over the Syrian Greeks, they took upon themselves the role of Kohen, Gadol, and Melech. And that was a big no-no. You can't have both. The separation of power, as a result, became the creation of the Sadducee Tzedukah party, which caused many problems. And in the end, that's one of the reasons that is. Why is there no discussion of Hanukkah in the Gemara in any great detail? Because the Hashmonaim in the end turned out to be bad people. The first generation, Matisyahu and his sons, good guys. After that, downhill. Because you can't be a Kohen and a king. And it just, there's all kinds of problems. The Bezdin has to confirm the appointment of a king. There's a lot of interesting, qualifications for this. The whole section of the Rambam Hilchos Malachim, the powers, the emergency rules that he has, the relationship with the king to the Sanhedrin, the ability to tax. It's interesting that a king has limitations, tremendous limitations on him. And among the things about a king that he has to do, a king must write his own Sefer Torah, and he must carry it with him all the time. Not having a library, literally, physically, carry a small Sefer Torah in his arms every day, wherever he goes, except when he's asleep. He has to literally carry that Sefer Torah with him to remind him that he is not the authority, that he is subject to the same authority as everybody else. Torah. Oh, yeah. Here we go. When he's enthroned on his throne, because of lo as a Mishnah Torah hazos a sefer, he has to write a Sefer Torah, v'hoisa imo, and it has to remain with him. The korabo kol yemei Chanukah, and he has to read from that Torah every single day. L'man yilma liras Hashem alakov. He has to inspire him, and lishmor is called divrei Torah azos. Literally, v'hoisa imo. What does v'hoisa imo mean? It has to remain with him. If you're a king, you have a chauffeur. No. You got to carry it with you. Okay, but again, the next pasuk says, why must he carry the Torah with him all the time? Because it's very easy. I mean, we've seen this from politicians. So I don't want to get current events of history, but we've seen how politicians can have an inflated image of themselves. Pasuk, enough said. In Pasuk Chaf, it says, why must he carry the Torah with him? Levilti rum levavo me'achav. So he shouldn't think he's better than anybody else. He occupies a position, but he's still chayiv in the same Taryag mitzvos, perhaps more mitzvos than the average Jew.
Wally,
Ulevilti sur min mitzvah, yamin usmo, and he shouldn't depart from the Torah left or right. And if he does this, Laman Yarich Yomim Amamlachto, who one of, which means inherited, the Kerev Yisrael. He has to do that so that he remains like any other Jew, obligated in all the mitzvahs. And we've seen so many times when the kings don't follow the Torah, that's their downfall. That's their downfall. Yes, Nathan.
what about when he goes into the bathhouse or the base kise?
That might be an exception. That might be an exception. It doesn't carry the Torah with him to the bathroom. But other than that, he has to keep it with him all the time. The rules, again, in Judaism, the rules for a king are much more stringent than I think in the monarchy of any other civilized nation. In most countries where I have a king, the king is above everybody else. He is exempt from certain things. Not in Judaism. In Judaism, A, it's situational or optional, but B, he is no better than, and he's the same Jew that has to observe all the mitzvahs in the Torah, the same obligation goes on the king. So even though the Rambam and one or two others would maintain that there is a positive mitzvah to appoint the king, most authorities, most of the morning mitzvahs would tell you that it's not necessarily obligatory to have a king. We have a structure set up. We have Kohanim, we have Leviim, we have Sanhedrin. That's our structure. We have an executive branch. We have a judicial branch, and we have a legislative branch. We don't need an executive branch, theoretically. However, historically, many people felt a lack, because the lack was not necessarily the lack of a king, it was lack of faith in the system. And whenever there was that lack of faith in the system, there's that cosine spiral again. That when they followed the Torah and they had good kings, they were successful, they were victorious. When they didn't, and they worshipped idols, and they had bad kings, they were conquered. Unfortunately, for most of the history, they always had kings. They always, once they entered the land, starting with Shaul HaMelech, from Shaul on, and for a while, when you didn't have kings, you had shoftim. But that period also coincided with a lot of kings as well. Yes. Yes. Again, the ideal system is not necessarily to have kings, and to have the Kohanim and the Leviim and the Sanhedrin pretty much rule for it. But that system, unfortunately, had limited success because, again, getting back to philosophy for a second, it's very easy for a Kadosh Baruch Hu to have created human beings as automatons, as robots, to observe Kol Torah Kula. That could have been done. But Hashem would prefer that people come to him out of ahava and not yira. Now it's when the Chodesh Elul. If you read Rambam, Hilchos Tshuva, there's a whole discussion there about tshuva mi ahava, tshuva mi yira. What is preferable? Obviously, tshuva mi ahava. But given the fact that by definition, human beings are weak, they need a little bit of push sometimes. And it has to be a melech, or it has to be a Sanhedrin. Depends on what particular time period you're living in. But clearly, if I had to make a decision, I would say that there's no independent mitzvah to appoint the king. It's an option. It's situational, if you will. If you want a king, if you think you need a king, then you may appoint a king. But you don't have to have a king. There's no need for a king. But historically, that's what we've had. Yeah.
Any government has to have an executive. You can't exist without it. Someone has to. Look, we had Moshe Rabbi, he was the executive. Then you had Shiur, he was the executive.
Correct.
But it has to be somebody who has the final say, to make sure everything meshes.
All right.
Whether it's Sanhedrin, basically,
So,
Sanhedrin and,
so what you're saying is that people need to have somebody to lay down the law for them, to enforce. So that was the function of Shoftim and the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin functioned in that. When the Sanhedrin functioned, they passed halachos, tarkanos, gezeros without a melech.
who makes sure that they follow.
Well, you had officers of the court. That was their job. But again, given the fact that humanity is frail, the system of kings was put into place, starting with Shaul HaMelech. It wasn't a desirable outcome, and we saw where it led, because by definition, look, Shlomo HaMelech was the wisest man that ever lived, and he made very bad choices. The Torah says, don't have too many wives. He had a lot of wives. Don't have too much gold and silver. He amassed a fortune. Don't have too many horses. He had stables. On and on and on. The Torah says what you shouldn't do, and yet he, as the wisest man of all, did all these things because he felt, I'm the wisest man. I can do whatever I want, and I won't fall prey to all the vices that the Torah tells me not to fall prey to. And in fact, he did. He married the wrong women. He made mistakes, and this was the wisest man. So he made mistakes. So again, many halachos are concessions to human frailty, and I think appointing a king is one of those mitzvahs. Yes.
We actually learned small now, learned shelter, and my recollection was that it's such a rocky, like you say, like the coastline, that seems to be, those of us who remember, it's a very rocky road. Good, bad, up and down, every time you turned around. So maybe that was part of the reason also why maybe they felt that there's necessity for a king. Because the type of leadership that they had just wasn't working.
So they were hoping that a king would straighten them out. Yeah. The problem is sometimes the kings themselves were corrupt.
Especially if the king that was selected wasn't the best choice.
This is why I'm of the opinion, like the Abarbanel and others, that this was not a mandatory mitzvah, it was an optional mitzvah. If you feel you need it, then you can do it with certain provisos. But it's one of the, again, it's like Isha Yafas Toar is a classic example. Not everybody is in a situation where you take captives in war. So that's a mitzvah that doesn't apply to most people. But if you're in that situation, then there is a halakhic practice to follow. So if you're in a situation where there's a need, or you think there's a need for a king, then you may appoint a king, but a king has to have certain qualifications, and king has to have certain, again, the importance of a king carrying a Torah with him can't be, emphasized enough. In most cultures, the king rules supreme. The king rules supreme. You can't buck the king. Right? In most cultures. Judaism says, no, it's not true. The king is subject to the same Torah laws that everybody's subject to. So it's a big difference. But even so, if we follow the Torah appropriately, then there would not be a need for a king, and we would follow the mitzvahs as they are described and as they are interpreted. So study Tanakh, take a look at all the history of all the Malachim, and you can judge for yourself to see whether it's a good idea or not. Have a great day.
Thank you, Wally. Thank you.
Have a good day, folks.
Thank you, Mandy.
Thank you.
Should